This is unprecedented. Is anyone certain what happens next?
So thank you very much, Dibal.
Fred. Dibal is on the evening show.
I know. Okay, so thank you very much. I think the consideration here is that we look at both the legal and political implications. Mm-hmm. When you talk about legal implication, we should always be alive to the fact that the courts do not act in vain. Every time a court gives a ruling, they have given a consideration as to the practicality of a ruling they give. So that you have a case whereby I would imagine the court already considers that there has been a sitting deputy president in that intervening period for now almost 2 years. Number two, you have a case of the then deputy president losing on the majority vote in parliament. That is a political reality. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, balances off with the substantive issues raised by the then deputy president. In this case, if you look at the case they brought to the court, is heavy on procedure. Whether the procedure was adhered to, whether indeed he was given a right to fair hearing, whether things like public participation were according to the threshold expected of such a process of that big magnitude. So you have a court that balances those. They put on one hand the political realities, but on the other hand, they consider the legal implication. Mm-hmm. And every time a ruling is given, all that is put into context so that you would understand, for example, why if you look at the prayers sought by the councils on record for the former deputy president, you can see creativity that tries to broaden the options for the court. For example, they seek compensation as one of the remedies. Mm-hmm. Reinstatement is among, but almost at the tail end. So you find that their main prayer is that the process be declared unconstitutional. In this case, it gets the former deputy president off the hook. Mm-hmm. And that means he becomes politically viable again to participate in political processes. Then at the same time, they can then seek, or they have sought the issue of compensation. So that even if the court grants those two without granting the third option, mm-hmm. that's still good for them. Okay. Alternatively, even just consider the process or declare the process nullity on the basis of procedure, but for example, because I'm trying to be creative here, I can imagine how the judges try to wiggle around. Possibly they may end up saying the question of the decision to make is a political decision, yes. And that is not in doubt. That may also be. So when you talk about either way and all that, the court always puts into consideration all those aspects. And I don't think it is something difficult for the court to make. Whether they uphold or they nullify, mm-hmm. they have had that consideration before in the name of a nullified election petition, that in this case presidential. For me, I think the holy grail was when the Constitution, when the Supreme Court nullified the presidential elections of 2017. Mm-hmm. Number two, when the High Court, again in 2021, nullified the BBI process, mm-hmm. which was a very big initiative for the government of then President Uhuru Kenyatta and the late Right Honorable Prime Minister. So with those two precedents, I can tell you without a doubt that you have courts that do not fear to exercise a decision despite how far-reaching it is. So it is then left to an observer to wait and see what kind of decision and to what end the court would want the same implemented.
Yes. But the challenge is, and still to you, Akili, mm-hmm. that we've had judgments or pronouncements by the court that have left Kenyans hanging. But on the pronouncement, for example, of who's the majority in the National Assembly, and a pronouncement was made by the court, but then Kenyans were waiting for something more to happen. And it's like there was no consequence to that pronouncement. Could that be a possibility this time around?
If you remember that decision, and that's where I think we always need to follow through, I feel it came a little bit, there was a timeline. The politicians connived, because if that decision was to come as soon as it was filed in court, because it took almost 6 months for the court to pronounce itself as to who is the, or which is the majority party in the House. By the time the decision was coming, the politicians had connived to quickly change the facts on the ground. Mm-hmm. So that by the time the decision was being read out in Parliament, the political realities had shifted, and it was a question of compliance as to time. Because if you talk about belonging to a coalition, there's a timeline given by the Political Parties Act, as well as the policy put in place, which would mean within what time are you supposed to remain in a coalition before you can cross over. So the politicians were creative enough to take advantage of the period of time to be able to cross over, so that you would say the decision was right, the decision made sense, the decision was legally sound. But as to its implementation, if you saw what Parliament did through the Speaker, they just said, okay, fine, we agree with the court, but in line with that decision, this particular grouping of MPs or this political party had already issued notice, and it has lapsed. So technically, I can then formally declare them to be part and parcel of this coalition, which then alters the numbers. So why I'm saying that the court considers the realities, in that case, it was a cut-paste decision, because it was a question of who is the majority party, and it was a question of arithmetic, how many numbers, and in terms of which are the coalition agreements in place. Now, for the Rigathi Gachagua, you're asking the court to determine, was the process done in accordance with the law? Then we start looking at public participation. The only small saving grace for Parliament on this impeachment process, if you remember then, the lawyers of the then Deputy President took the matter to court in advance, even before the impeachment vote could be taken. And one of the far-reaching decision that was given in the interim was the nature and the manner of public participation, which they said, because parliamentarians are the individual voters, then it is expected that public participation be done at the constituency level. I find that as a very momentous decision, because if not for that, it would have been the easy, low-hanging fruit. Whatever the defense or the applicants, in this case, the lawyers of the Deputy President, would have hanged on it and said the public participation did not meet the threshold. But in this case, the legislature was easy to argue that the court directed us, we complied, we had to even postpone the vote by extra 2-3 days just to ensure that we comply with this. Right. So on the balance of probabilities, as we say, it can go either way. The court is always realistic and is always alive to the political realities, especially for a political process with an outcome like that of an impeachment.
All right.
Thank you.
Advice from a leadership and governance standpoint.